Do you believe an object can hold a soul? Let me tell you about the doll that almost destroyed mine. I've always had a fascination with old, forgotten things. Antique stores, thrift shops, and flea markets were my favorite haunts. There's something about the mystery of the past that drew me in, the stories that old objects could tell. But sometimes, those stories are better left untold. This is the story of the forgotten doll that changed my life forever. It all started on a crisp autumn afternoon. I was wandering through a small, dusty antique store in a town I'd never been to before. The shelves were crammed with all sorts of items, old books, faded photographs, tarnished silverware. As I turned a corner, I saw it. Sitting on a high shelf, almost hidden behind a stack of old records, was a porcelain doll. She had curly blonde hair, pale blue eyes, and a faded pink dress. Something about her drew me in, and before I knew it, I was taking her to the counter. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with a knowing look in her eyes, hesitated when she saw the doll. "Are you sure you want this one?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. I nodded, feeling a strange compulsion to own the doll. She wrapped it up carefully and handed it to me. As I left the store, I thought I heard her whisper, "Be careful." I brought the doll home and placed it on a shelf in my living room. That night, I had the first of many nightmares. I dreamt of a little girl, crying in a dark room, calling out for someone to help her. Her voice was filled with such despair that it haunted me even after I woke up. I shook it off, blaming the creepy atmosphere of the antique store for my restless sleep. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee, I noticed that the doll had moved. She was now facing the window, her eyes seemingly gazing out into the yard. I brushed it off, thinking I must have bumped the shelf without realizing it. But then it happened again the next day. And the day after that. Each morning, the doll was in a different position, always facing a different direction. By the end of the week, I was beginning to feel uneasy. I decided to put the doll in a box and store it in the attic. As I placed her inside and closed the lid, I felt a strange chill run down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling and went about my day. That night, the nightmares returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. The little girl was now calling my name, her cries more desperate, more insistent. A few days later, I went up to the attic to retrieve some old photo albums. As I rummaged through the boxes, I felt something brush against my ankle. I looked down and saw the doll, sitting upright on the floor, staring at me with her cold, blue eyes. I hadn't even opened the box since I put her there. My heart pounded in my chest as I picked her up and put her back in the box, this time taping it shut. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind, seemed amplified, filling me with dread. At around 3 a.m., I heard a noise coming from the attic. It sounded like something was scratching against the wood. I grabbed a flashlight and reluctantly made my way up the stairs. As I opened the attic door, the scratching stopped. I shone the light around, my hands trembling. The box with the doll was still taped shut, but there were scratch marks all over it, as if something had been trying to get out. I decided I couldn't keep the doll in the house any longer. The next day, I took the box to a nearby field and dug a hole, deep enough that I hoped no one would ever find it. I buried the doll and covered the hole, feeling a strange sense of relief. I thought my ordeal was over, but I was wrong. That night, I had the worst nightmare yet. The little girl was there again, but this time she wasn't crying. She was angry. She screamed at me, her voice echoing in my head. "Why did you leave me?" she shouted. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake. Over the next few days, strange things started happening around the house. Doors would slam shut on their own, lights would flicker, and I would hear whispers, faint and indistinct, coming from the corners of the rooms. I felt like I was being watched, no matter where I went. The atmosphere in the house grew more oppressive, more sinister. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a noise coming from the backyard. I looked out the window and saw a figure standing by the spot where I had buried the doll. It was the little girl from my nightmares, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light. She was digging frantically, dirt flying everywhere. I watched in horror as she unearthed the box and opened it. She lifted the doll out and hugged it to her chest, then turned her gaze towards my window. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. I didn't need to. The message was clear, she was coming for me. I ran downstairs and locked all the doors and windows, but I knew it was futile. The sense of impending doom was overwhelming. I grabbed a chair and sat in the middle of the living room, clutching a flashlight, my eyes darting around the room. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The sun began to rise, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it all. Then I heard the whisper, right behind me. "Why did you leave me?" I spun around, and there she was, the little girl, holding the doll. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her expression was one of pure hatred. She stepped closer, and I backed away, my heart pounding. "You took her away from me," she said, her voice a cold whisper. "Now you have to pay." The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled with the flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices filling the room. I felt something cold brush against my arm, and I screamed, stumbling backwards. I ran out of the house, not stopping until I reached my car. I drove aimlessly, trying to put as much distance between myself and that cursed house as possible. Eventually, I ended up at a motel on the outskirts of town. Exhausted and terrified, I rented a room and collapsed on the bed, trying to calm my racing heart. The nightmares continued, each one worse than the last. The little girl was relentless, her anger growing with each passing night. She would appear at the foot of my bed, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light, her voice echoing in my head. "You can't escape me," she would whisper. "You will never escape me." Desperate, I sought the help of a paranormal investigator. I told him everything, from finding the doll, to the nightmares and the haunting. He listened patiently, then nodded. "There are spirits that become attached to objects," he explained. "And it sounds like this doll has a very powerful one. We need to perform a cleansing ritual to break the attachment." We returned to the house, armed with sage, salt, and other tools for the ritual. As we began, the atmosphere grew heavy, and the whispers intensified. The investigator chanted in a language I didn't understand, burning sage and spreading salt in a circle around the house. I watched, my heart pounding, as he worked to cleanse the space. Suddenly, the little girl appeared, her eyes blazing with fury. She screamed, a sound that pierced my very soul, and the investigator was thrown across the room. I rushed to his side, but he was unconscious. The little girl turned her gaze on me, and I felt a cold hand wrap around my throat. "You can't get rid of me," she hissed. "You will never be free." With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed the sage and lit it, waving it in front of me. The girl shrieked and backed away, her form flickering like a candle flame. I continued the chant the investigator had taught me, my voice trembling but determined. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Finally, with one last, ear-piercing scream, the little girl vanished. The room grew still, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. The investigator slowly regained consciousness, and I helped him to his feet. "It's done," he said, his voice weak. "She's gone." I moved out of the house the next day, leaving everything behind. I couldn't stay there, not after what had happened. I found a new place, far away from that cursed town, and started over. The nightmares faded, and the whispers ceased. But the memory of the little girl and the forgotten doll haunted me, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most innocent of objects. But the story doesn't end there. Even after moving to a new town, the sense of unease never entirely left me. I would often catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. Shadows seemed to linger just a bit longer than they should, and at night, the feeling of being watched returned. One particularly restless night, I decided to go for a walk to clear my mind. The town was quiet, the streets empty. As I wandered, I found myself drawn to a small park. I sat on a bench, staring up at the moon, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned and saw a figure standing at the edge of the park, half hidden in the shadows. It was the little girl, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. She stepped forward, the doll clutched tightly in her arms. "You can't escape me," she whispered, her voice carried on the wind. "You will never escape me." Panic surged through me as I stumbled back, tripping over the bench. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, gasping for breath, my mind racing. I realized then that I could never truly be free. The doll, the little girl, they were bound to me in some unholy way. No matter where I went, they would follow, their presence a constant reminder of the darkness I had unwittingly invited into my life. In the weeks that followed, I tried everything I could think of to rid myself of the curse. I consulted with more paranormal experts, tried countless cleansing rituals, and even considered moving again. But nothing worked. The nightmares persisted, the whispers grew louder, and the feeling of being watched never left me. One night, as I lay in bed, exhausted and defeated, I heard the familiar whisper. "Why did you leave me?" I sat up, staring into the darkness. The little girl stood at the foot of my bed, her eyes filled with tears. "You took her away from me," she said, her voice trembling. "Now you have to pay." I realized then that there was no escape. The doll, the little girl, they were a part of me now. And as long as I lived, I would never be free of their haunting presence. The darkness that had invaded my life was here to stay, a constant reminder of the dangers that lurk in the most innocent of objects. So, if you ever find yourself in an antique store, drawn to an old, forgotten doll, remember my story. Some things are better left undisturbed, their mysteries unsolved. Because sometimes, those mysteries can consume you, dragging you into a nightmare from which there is no escape. And so, the tale of the forgotten doll serves as a chilling reminder of the unknown horrors that can lie within the seemingly innocent objects of our past. Be cautious, for you never know what darkness you might unleash.